Hey everybody, welcome to week 9. We're almost through to the end of the class. A couple updates. Make sure that you are prepared to submit your final assignment this week. You have a 3-2-1 assignment. The directions should be in the document, but if there's any confusion on it, please email me. I'm happy to help, and it is going to be based off of one of the readings of your choice that are available this week. Beyond that, make sure you're ready to turn in your final exam and final essay right around the corner. I will make sure I have those dates in the final slide, and we got this. So let's start talking about institutions and how to make change in the United States. So learning objectives for part 1, we're going to understand what framing is. We're going to look at what the primary goal of interest groups are. We're going to look at the supremacy clause. We're going to identify 2 different definitions to the term nationalization. Also provide, once again, a concrete term for pluralism, and additionally, understand a key difference between soft and hard news. So let's talk about public opinion. Public opinion generally, of course, we all know this as the aggregate of individual attitudes or beliefs shared by a population or a portion of the population. When we talk about issues, we remember there are 3 things that guide individuals to vote the way they do: party identification, candidate characteristics, and issues involved. Out of those issues involved, we remember that there are spatial and valence issues. Spatial issues, a wide range of positions, a little bit of review here, but wide range of positions. Think about minimum wage, think about any policy issue in which you could have more than 3 positions on it. Valence issues, think of them as issues where all voters prefer a higher value, honesty of representatives, access to government, efficiency of government, productivity, of course, things of that nature. And when we think of the term framing, which is very essential to understanding public opinion, we understand that this is establishing the context for a polling question or a media report. Framing often means placing an event or a question into a familiar story or activating preconceived conceptions or beliefs. And that's an important aspect of this definition. Understanding that framing is something that oftentimes mobilizes or diminishes preconceived notions or beliefs or prejudices oftentimes. We also understand when we talk about this is something I've pointed out in emails to a couple of you, and I think it is very important when we look at our final essay, the difference between empirical and normative statements. And this is something that when engaging with public opinion, when engaging with news, it is important to aim for empirical analyses and acknowledge normative claims. So an empirical claim or empirical analysis is really a statement based on the assessment of data without regard to value judgments. Think of, you know, the cost of living has gone up in the state of Montana. That is, and then I would cite data measuring the cost of living over time. Now, if I said the cost of living has gone up in Montana because my experience is I have to spend more money when I go to the grocery store, that is a normative statement because it is driven by my perception of the issue at hand. Now, if it is not driven by an individual perception and instead by data, you have an empirical statement. For example, when I said cost of living is going up in Montana due to Gallup polling that indicates that this has been occurring over 20 years. That would be an empirical statement. But if you think about it, really I'm saying somewhat the same thing with both in 2 different ways, but it is essential to make sure when you write a professional paper in political science, you dismiss your normative claims and find ways to present them in empirical ways. So when we talk about government at large, institutions, one of the main things is understanding that our federal system in the United States has a unique relationship between state and the federal entities. So a few key things we have to remember when we talk about this relationship between the state and federal governments is that the Supremacy Clause, the 9th and 10th Amendment, and selective incorporation. So when we talk about this relationship at large, oftentimes in a federal system, you see state governments acting as what many refer to as laboratories of change. The state governments give you the opportunity to test unique legislative approaches or policy positions. If successful, they can be implemented on the federal level. One aspect of this relationship between state and federal law that's important to remember is the supremacy clause. Supremacy clause simply states federal law always trumps state law. If there is a disagreement or a feud between the state and federal legislation, the federal law is what will be enforced. Federal authority shall be the law of the land and override state conflicts. Now, when there is no direct reference to a specific issue on the federal level, states have the ability, due to the 9th and 10th Amendment, primarily the 10th Amendment, which allows state governments to address any legislation that is not directly handled or directly presented within our U.S. Constitution or statutory laws on the federal level. So, if the federal government does not address specific legislation, it is left up to the states and specifically the people. Now, when we talk about the 9th and 10th Amendment, it's important to remember that this is a key part of the Bill of Rights. And when we talk about the Bill of Rights, we remember that this was not originally intended to restrict state rights, but exclusively restrict the federal government. So, what did we have to do to make it where the current Bill of Rights and all amendments thereafter apply to states as well and protect our individual liberties instead of our state liberties? We see that a period of selective incorporation had to occur. Selective incorporation occurred in the 1830s after Barron v. Baltimore Supreme Court ruling, in which determined that the Bill of Rights only applied to the federal government. Well, after this ruling, through numerous rulings in lower courts and in the Supreme Court, on a case-by-case basis, our Bill of Rights and all amendments applied to restricting the state governments as well as the federal governments. And this has been completely finished by mid-1900s. Now, I also want to make sure we understand two key definitions of a similar word. So you hear, if you go on to study political science at large, and when you take some upper division classes, you may come across the term nationalization. Now, you may see it through a social reference framework, which we'll see at the bottom of the slide, or a more market-oriented framework, as you can see in the original definition provided. So it is important to remember two ways to define nationalization. The first, market-oriented definition, is the transition that brings privately owned industries and companies under public authority. Think of in 2001, after the tragedy of 9/11, the federal government nationalized airport security. That made it so airport security was unanimous among all states. We see on the federal level, some specific changes can impact the entire nation. That is because the airport security business, I guess you could say, is nationalized and ran by our federal government. And you could see just a few weeks ago, we had the new rule come out that you don't have to take your shoes off at airports, come down from the federal level and immediately go into effect in all states. An example of how nationalization is the bringing privately owned goods or industries into public authority, or federal authority, similar to airport security. We have a current push for the government to do this regarding healthcare, and you see that provided the nationalization of healthcare in some European states. Also, when we look at nationalization, we can see the social definition. When you study political polarization and civil society, you'll come across this term here and there. This definition of nationalization, the social one, is a transition from a locally oriented presence to a nationally oriented one. Think of the transition that happened from your parents' time to our time, where your parents would read the Daily Interlake, or if you're down in Missoula, the Missoulian or the Independent, a local newspaper that is embedded in local perspectives. And that is often how individuals would see the world around them. But if we gather news, oftentimes we are less likely in our generation to cite things like the Daily Interlake, and more likely to cite things like the New York Times or Fox News or CNN, MSNBC, whatever it may be. We are likely to gravitate towards social media maybe. nationally focused news sources that don't embed you through the perspective and lens of somebody who lives in your local community. So a nationalization is transitioning from focusing on locally oriented presence to a nationally oriented presence. We see this occurring predominantly in recent years when studying political polarization due to the technological shifts within our institution of the media. So that is why we have technology oftentimes driving the push towards nationalization as we are more able to globalize, trade globally, and communicate globally and nationally. Now, the institution of the media, a great transition into this point. The media is currently witnessing a period of nationalization. As we previously pointed out in the last slide, we are focusing on the social definition of nationalization, of course, not the market. So, by social definition, we see that the institution of the media has a higher tendency to encourage individuals to gravitate towards a national lens when examining news, either when it's local, international, or national news. So we see, I will post this on Eagle Online. It will not be a required reading as it is a higher level political science reading, but I think it's very beneficial to be able to read and skim. There's a study presented by Lisa George and Joel Waldfogel where they examine the impact of what happens if the New York Times is distributed in a new population, specifically a rural population that does not have as much national news. So this occurred in the early 2000s as they studied this population that just recently had the new market of the New York Times. By that I mean the New York Times just started selling their newspaper in this small population. The population I am not certain of. It's been a, you know, I'm you can look into that. I don't believe it's even expressed in the reading, but you can double check me on that. But when they looked at what occurs to the market, the newspaper market, and the general population in that area after the New York Times was introduced, they saw a surprising shift. A couple things happened. There were predominantly two changes. The one change was that they saw a segregation of information. What do I mean by this? By a segregation of information, I mean that those who predominantly had a college education would gravitate towards reading the New York Times, while those who did not have college educations and were tended to be more rooted in their local lens. Those individuals were more likely to read that population's version of the Daily Interlake or the Independent or Missouli. So we'll see that it encouraged different subsets of the population to read different sources of news. Now, beyond encouraging certain people to read certain news sources and dismiss others, we saw the local newspaper was incentivized to change how they presented the news. Previously, before the New York Times was introduced, they would spend half of their focus covering international news, but oftentimes embedding it through the perspective of their local rural town. And what happened after the New York Times was introduced is that this was discouraged. These individuals then, these local newspapers then did not even cover these national news stories, instead leaving it to the publications that have more resources to spend on international focuses. So the New York Times would focus on more international news and national news with a framework with a subset of the population that has a college education gravitating towards it, and the local newspaper had the non-college educated individuals and maintained an even heavier focus on local news. So we see through this lens, examining the institution of the media, that technology is altering the media landscape and leading to a degree of nationalization which is occurring within the institution of the media. Now, when we look at news, there is another important distinction we have to make, and this is between hard and soft news. And after we cover these definitions, I really want to ask you, what is the majority of the news you obtain? Is it soft or hard news? What is the news that you care most about? Soft or hard news? Now, these definitions. Hard news. This is traditional news that really derives its value from its relevance, from recent events, relevant events that have some impact on the life of the reader and viewers. Think of weather, the best example of hard news. A storm is coming to your area. We have fires in the valley. you may be impacted. There may be air alerts. There may be something you must do to counteract these environmental impacts. Now, an example of soft news. Soft news are oftentimes think about featured stories, celebrities, sports. These are news items that derive their value from interest, proximity, timeliness, or relevance to the reader or the viewer, not necessarily based on impact to the reader or viewer. So, of course, this is Kim Kardashian, this is Kanye, this is music, this is sports. Knicks, go Knicks, yes, Knicks. All right, back on track. So we have a key distinction here between hard and soft news. And of course, as you listen to this slide, ask yourself, what is the majority of the news you obtain? Is there one of these forms that you should gravitate towards more often? Okay, so let's begin talking about interest groups. Interest groups are, well, the best way to describe them are they're like-minded, they're collectives of like-minded individuals with the primary purpose of impacting government in a way that presents their interests to our government, our elected representatives, and oftentimes these are the interests of individuals, collectives, groups, and corporations. So we can look at interest groups' primary goal being to represent the interests of specific groups and corporations to elected representatives. There are a wide range of different interest groups. We have ideological, economic, special interest, professional, and so much more. Some examples consist that show how niche certain interest groups are is the Mothers Against Drunk Driving interest group that is frequently lobbying on in Congress. We also see interest groups tailored towards economic interests. We have them tailored towards the National Rifle Association, a wide range, oftentimes ideological, economic, or professional. When we look at the responsibility of interest groups, one thing that comes up often is the term lobbying. Lobbying is attempting to influence the content of policy by exerting influence on government officials. And by exerting influence, we mean by representing our interests. We mean by contributing to funds, to campaigns to enable them to be elected. Oftentimes, especially in the past, you would see lobbying efforts being presented in ways that they would try and provide this information to our elected representatives. We had frequent engagement between lobbyists and representatives, and this was oftentimes beneficial as this was their opportunity to educate elected representatives of the interests of a subset of their population that they may not have had direct access to. So it is oftentimes a very productive tool for making sure that minority interests are represented and heard. We also see a term that comes up when we talk about lobbying and the actions of interest groups, which is zero-sum policy. This is a policy debate in which any victory by one side comes at the expense of the opposing side, resulting in a lack of compromise. This is why the task for interest groups is not to run government, but to represent their interests to elected representatives who do run government. Zero-sum policy is the reality that with a wide range of interest groups come conflicting interest groups. And that is why we have to have as many interest groups as possible representing every position along a single spectrum that can be represented to our elected representatives, and they can then make the educated decision to either listen to one, the other, or find the middle ground. That's the general overview. I hit space, but it didn't go to the next one. General overview of interest groups. Now, when we look at the key takeaways from this slide, this was a little quicker than I oftentimes do this lecture. I wanted to make sure we have more time to focus on avenues of change, a more applicable aspect of today's lecture. But make sure at the end we understand what framing is, what the primary goal and responsibility of interest groups are through lobbying, be able to define lobbying, understand what the supremacy clause is, identify and present the two definitions of nationalization, both market and social, understand what pluralism is. I did not cover this in today's lecture. I actually took this out to be a little quicker, but make sure that you review past slides and understand pluralism is the reality of multiple groups vying for power within a single system of government. There is a wide range of ways to define pluralism, as long as you generally convey the point of multiple groups, a single system, working together. And understand, most importantly, what the difference between hard and soft news is. Here are your answers, and here is part 2. Let's talk about how to make change in the United States. So today's learning objectives, we're going to look at what social movements are, how they operate. I'll look at a couple examples of grassroots movements. And if you have any social movements that you would encourage that I examine in future lectures, I would love if you emailed me and let me know, and I would be more than happy to present them. I use the ones I use in today's lecture because they're the ones that have garnered the most attention by the general population. We also want to look at how many avenues there are to implementing a new amendment to the Constitution. There are 2. What are these avenues? We will look at that in just a moment. How many steps are there in each avenue? Some key things that will be asked on your final exam. We're also going to understand if you can repeal a constitutional amendment, how do you do it? And, well, if so, how do you do it? We're also going to look at indirect avenues to implement change in the United States. Just a quick discussion. Also look at a period in U.S. history in 1968 when the United States was very close to abolishing the Electoral College, but this did not occur, although we had roughly 80% of the general population, according to Gallup polling, citing that they would prefer the abolition of the Electoral College. And finally, we will conclude by examining some key amendments that help us understand how change is made in the United States. That being the 18th, 21st, and our most recent constitutional amendment, the 27th, which was implemented in the 1990s. So, what do we already know from this course about how the political landscape changes? Well, we remember from our lecture on political parties, third-party candidates can represent an interest or a position that the general population maintains but is not adequately represented. Think of the campaigns of Theodore Roosevelt, George Wallace, and Ross Perot. Theodore Roosevelt representing a need for more government intervention at a time of dire need. George Wallace representing the unspoken interests of those who are pro-segregationists in the 1960s. And Ross Perot representing the interests of those who believed we needed a more middle ground approach to governance and were tired of the two-party system. Now, when we look at those 3 campaigns, we do have to remember them and remember generally that what the impact they had, revealed the sentiments of those populations, those specific issues, and impacted the final result of the presidential election as they each garnered at least 10% of the popular vote. Now, we also understand just through past experiences that unique candidates, just as we also remember, one of the 3 reasons that we vote the way we do, candidate characteristics, we see that these unique candidates and their characteristics oftentimes obtain a large percent of the primary or federal vote. And again, even if they're not third-party candidates, they can reveal the interests of a significant subset of the population. Think about the campaigns of Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump in the last decade. This revealed a segment of the population that felt underrepresented. Early on in Donald Trump's political career, you heard frequent sentiments of drain the swamp, calling out the elite establishment and focusing on a new approach to governance. Bernie Sanders, a similar approach. Instead, through the drain the swamp sentiment, you would hear the 99% against the 1% sentiment, and the revealed the subset of the population that was more open and preferring of the idea of higher marginal tax rates. So you see those 2 unique candidates and their campaigns represent a large percentage of the population, the general population, and their interests. We also see 2 key terms that we learned early on in this course, party realignment and party de-alignment. Party realignment, when a substantial number of voters, remember, substantial number of voters, driven by the voters, not the political party, a substantial number of voters leaves one party for the other, well, one subset of the political party. It is a bottom-up occurrence. Party de-alignment is when a substantial number of voters, bottom up, the voters drive this, do not identify with either of the two primary political parties. Now, we have a new term here at the bottom, tipping. This will be important to remember for the final exam. Tipping is when a group is growing in size over time and they eventually grow so large that they shift the political balance in a district, state, or country. There is a Netflix documentary that I always reference when talking about the term tipping. This is, I think it was called Wild Wild Country or something. It was about a cult that started in India and they would wear all orange. It's been a while since I've seen it. But I remember one of the key takeaways from this documentary is it perfectly conveys tipping because this was a cult that originated in India and then one day they moved to a small rural town in Oregon. And in this rural town in Oregon, they originally were a small subset of the population, but over time they continued to gain more followers, gain more people that lived on their compound at the time, and they grew so much in size that they shifted the political balance in the district, state, or country. Without gaining a vote from the general population that existed before, they were able to elect individuals of their own community to public office, obtain seats on the city council, and positions like that. So tipping is when a group that is growing in size over time grows large enough to shift the political balance in a district, state, or country. And when we talk about change in the United States, it is essential to understand that there are countless ways to make change. You do not have to go about one of the presented ways in today's lecture, but you could also make change by legislative actions by Congress, advocating to your elected representatives. They can change constitutional amendments, they can implement new legislation. We can also look at actions of the President of the United States. If you elect a unique candidate, as we've seen in the recent years, you can see unique policy positions occurred represented through executive order. Neat detail about executive orders. Donald Trump has in his second term in office broke the record for most executive orders signed within the first 100 days. Previously it was 99 by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and now it is held by Donald Trump. I do not know exactly where he finished his 100 days at, but I believe it was somewhere around 115. But the record was broken. We do not necessarily need to remember records. You will not be asked that on a quiz. Sometimes it's fun to learn new things. So we also know that we can make change in the United States through decisions of the federal courts. Think about our countless Supreme Court rulings, which we will review in just a moment. Also, the activities of the political parties, shifting focus between issues, oftentimes is driven by grassroots movement, oftentimes social movements, that shift the focus within the political parties, eventually shifting focus within the president and legislative and sometimes even judicial courts. We see in addition the application of new customs and traditions within government and expressions of civil unrest, a tool often used by the general population and when used properly without violence or destruction, you can see very productive expressions of civil unrest. Social movements and protest. So on the topic of civil unrest, let's talk about social movements for a second. They're understood as purposeful, organized groups striving to work towards a common goal. We all know that, and it is important to make sure we have that maintained definition. These groups might be attempting to create change, like Occupy Wall Street back in the day. I don't know if you remember that. There was the anonymous social movement. There is the most well-known international movement of the Arab Springs that brought significant change to the regions of the Middle East and dismantled a lot of authoritarian governments in that region. We also see anti-globalization movements, which often encourage a new approach to trade. So we see when we look at social movements at large, we understand that one key term that is beneficial to understand is understanding what a grassroots movement is. A grassroots movement is an organized effort undertaken by groups of individuals in a given geographic region to bring about specific change. Now, we see that in a grassroots movement, the main takeaway here is this is a bottom-up movement. It is driven by the general population, and they're calling for change to occur within the state or federal governments. We see that some examples of grassroots movements, think of the civil rights movement, think of the Me Too movement early on, and how they used social media to represent the interests of individuals in a specifically geographically specific location, the United States, to bring about change. We also see a term, well, one thing that we have to understand when talking about social movements is the inevitable realities of a pluralist society. That term pluralism, all social movements will always incentivize the creation of a counter movement. This is an inevitable factor of human nature when studying government at large. And all these three main points of grassroots movements, counter movements, and the free rider problem are the three main takeaways I identified when taking a course at the higher level on social movements in the United States, although there's a lot more to it. So we see when we look at that final term I referenced, the free rider problem. We've heard this before, but when we talk about social movements, it's important to understand that the free rider problem will persist. It is when those who benefit from resources, public goods, and common pool resources do not pay for them or underpay. Think of the civil rights movement, individuals that were fighting for their right to vote in the 1950s and 60s. And there were also individuals who, in the 1970s, obtained the easy access to the right to vote for the first time, but did not participate in the marches and protests that would eventually lead to them obtaining the right to vote. They represent a part of the free rider problem. Individuals who may have been able to contribute, but simply did not at the time. Now, there are certain movements that can be overwhelmed by the free rider problem, but oftentimes you see a constant persistence of a certain level of the free rider problem that will not even necessarily derail a social movement at large. Now, we also remember, we live in a representative democracy. It relies on our participation through our elected representatives, through advocating our interests to those elected representatives. We do not have necessarily a direct democracy with frequent referendums, mass votes on specific government action. So it is essential to utilize tools of social movements and protests to represent interests when in dire need. And essential, of course, to do so peacefully. We look at the civil rights movement and we see the success that came from that era and that movement due to the peaceful protests, the peaceful boycotts, the peaceful sit-ins, in which if there were violence, it was not led by the protesters. And we talk about social movements for one last slide. I use these three social movements. These are good examples of grassroots movements, but I use these three movements to represent how social media is used in social movements. And again, I emphasize that I picked these three movements because they have garnered the most national attention in the last decade. And when you study political science, these are ones that are oftentimes studied because of that focus on the national level. If you would encourage me to cover a different social movement in future slides, I am all ears. All ears, and we could have any and all discussions. Please email me. I love to have your interests represented in my lectures in the future. So please reach out. My filter for this is it well known on the national level, and will the vast majority of students in the class have some recollection of these movements in their lives? So why do I use these three? Well, because social movements have the unique ability to use social media to present atrocities occurring to a certain population, to distribute footage of maybe said atrocities, or schedule mass nationwide protests. And these three movements perfectly convey these three activities. We saw in the Me Too movement, social media was a platform to present the atrocities individuals in authority did to those who worked under them within specifically the film industry at the time. You saw a lot of stories being published. Twitter was a primary tool for this movement, and you would see stories being told with individuals oftentimes being named. This did result in numerous arrests for numerous problematic violations, simply put. We also look at the Black Lives Matter movement. Social media was successfully utilized to distribute footage of police oversteps that resulted in deaths of individuals to protest nationwide, specifically in 2020, although the movement persisted prior and afterwards. We see the Black Lives Matter movement successfully took footage of moments. We do know the horrible events that occurred to those George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, numerous others. And of course, it is important to know that no matter how you feel about these political movements, these social movements, these issues, we have to acknowledge the successful ways that they utilize the tools at hand. Me Too movement presented the atrocities that occurred to them through storytelling with Twitter. Black Lives Matter distributed footage through online social media platforms. And March for Our Lives was a protest that occurred in around I believe the 2020s, 2021, in reaction to the Parkland shooting that occurred in the United States, in which numerous lives were lost, many of which were young individuals at the hands of a gunman. And this was resulted in social media being utilized to schedule one of the, at the time, largest mass nationwide protests, in which you had speeches given in countless cities, people marching through the main streets of many primary cities, all on the exact same day and time. Now, why did we talk about these three movements? Because they present atrocities using social media, they distribute footage using social media, and they schedule events using social media. We have had this occur with multiple social movements, but these three are the most well known and easily convey the way social media is used. Now, when we talk about, as I mentioned before, the Supreme Court, it is important to understand the impact of some of our Supreme Court rulings and how they created immediate ripple effects in the way that laws are being enforced nationwide. So, when we look at this, we're going to do a little review. Remember Roe v. Wade and Dobbs v. Jackson. The impact, of course, being in the 1970s through Roe v. Wade's ruling, the protection of women's reproductive rights on a federal level, or abortion access, whatever you want to frame that issue as, you have the ability to. And we see in Dobbs v. Jackson, a 2021, I believe, or 2022 ruling, in which we had the overturning of Roe v. Wade, and the issue of women's reproductive rights was then a state's issue based off the premise that our Constitution did not provide direct protection for bodily autonomy or independence in that sense through our Constitution. We also see Brown v. Board of Education provided the brought forward the desegregation of public schools in the United States, driven by the premise that separate is not equal. We also see the United States versus Nixon. This is a Supreme Court ruling in which we did not really focus on in this course, but it was in response to the Watergate scandal. We saw that the Supreme Court unanimously ruled that President Richard Nixon was not above the law and had to comply with a subpoena to release tapes he had recorded in the Oval Office. These tapes, once released, were a foundational point to lead to what was going to be a possible impeachment and removal from office. But before an impeachment procedure could even go forward, he stepped down and resigned. A little bit of review for more impeachment slides as well. We also remember Obergefell versus Hodges. This is a Supreme Court ruling we covered a couple times in this course already, but it was a 2015 landmark ruling in which the Supreme Court held that fundamental right to marriage is guaranteed to same-sex couples by both the Due Process Clause and the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. This decision legalized same-sex marriage nationwide and provided a lot of protections when it comes to marriage for others within our nation, like those with disabilities. We see also Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission. This was a case we covered in which the ruling provided that the provided by the Supreme Court held that corporate funding of independent political broadcasts and candidate elections cannot be limited under the First Amendment's free speech protections. Simply put, you cannot limit the money in politics without directly limiting free speech. This created super PACs and mobilized corporations to be able to spend more money than previously able, as super PACs allow for unregulated amounts of money, but regulations regarding how the super PAC then can spend that money. So, of course, we understand the immediate impact of Supreme Court rulings within the United States and the ripple effect they have among society. So, one of the primary avenues to change is through our judicial system. How do you get to the Supreme Court? We remember three-tiered court system: district, circuit, supreme. Start at the district. If you have a challenge of the ruling, then you could bring it up to the circuit. You could bring it to the appeals court. Then, if you want to challenge that ruling, you could then bring it to the Supreme Court as well, if the Chief Justice accepts the case, in which they only accept about 80 a year. So if you're not one of the 80, how else can you make change in the United States? Well, you can change the Constitution. How do you do that? Well, it's a responsibility of our elected representatives, but the use of social movements, social media, can help you obtain the interests of our elected representatives. So, how do you change the Constitution? Article 5 addresses this. This does require a supermajority, a 2/3 vote, and there are two ways to implementing change. One way is congressional proposal. The second is constitutional convention. We basically do not use constitutional convention to make amendments to our Constitution. There was only one time this had occurred, and it is in early American history. So when we read Article 5 of our Constitution, it says directly, the Congress, we'll quote, the Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to this Constitution, or on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states, shall call a convention for proposing amendments, which in either case shall be valid to all intents and purposes, as part of this Constitution, when ratified by the legislature of 3/4 of the several states, or by convention in 3/4 thereof, as the one or the other mode of ratification may be proposed by the Congress, provided that no amendment which may be made prior to the year 1808 shall in any manner affect the first and fourth clauses in the 9th section of the first article, and that no state without its consent shall be deprived of its equal suffrage in the Senate. So we see that there are two primary avenues to implementing constitutional change provided in the text I just read to you. That is Article 5 of our Constitution. So what are these avenues? And here's a visualization of the two approaches to amending our Constitution, to proposing a constitutional amendment. You have the first on the left here, proposal by Congress. An individual, an elected representative, can propose a constitutional amendment. They would then have to get 2/3 majority vote in their body, either the House or the Senate, and then also the next body, the House or the Senate. So 2/3 majority vote in both bodies, and once that has occurred, you then need 3/4 of all state legislatures, so the majority of the state legislatures, to then ratify it in their independent states, and 3/4 of all states. Once ratified, the constitutional amendment will be implemented to the United States federal Constitution. If you are a part of those 1/4 of states that did not ratify an amendment through your state legislature, you are still susceptible to that ruling because the supremacy clause. Once it is a federal amendment to our Constitution, to our federal Constitution, you then must abide by it due to the supremacy clause. We also see the other avenue, the less focused on avenue for constitutional change, which is constitutional convention. You would need at first a petition by 2/3 of all state legislatures. Then, if this was obtained, Congress would call convention and amendments would be proposed. There would be detailed debate, and if there was an amendment that would be forwarded outside of this convention, it would be brought to the states for ratification, and it would go through the final step that the final stage of the other step we just examined. So we see this approach of proposal or convention, although nearly all of our recent constitutional amendments occurred through proposal, the approach that is visible on the left of your screen. Now, when we talk about an amendment, can you repeal an amendment? Say you implemented an amendment and 10 years go by and you realize this is not working out. Well, you can. You can repeal a constitutional amendment. You can change a change we made to our Constitution. How do you do that? Well, you have to change the Constitution again. You have to implement a new constitutional amendment. And this is where we get the chance to talk about two specific constitutional amendments in U.S. history, the 18th and the 21st. The 18th Amendment provided prohibition. You probably heard about this in high school history. You probably know about this because, well, it's a fascinating point in U.S. history. We abolished the sale and consumption of alcoholic beverages in the United States for a significant period of time through the 18th Amendment. And this, of course, went through the proposal stages. It was proposed, ratified by 3/4 of the states, of course, approved by 2/3 majority in the House and the Senate, and we had the prohibition of alcoholic beverages. This is where things like speakeasies came to be, and you'll hear that throughout various towns in the United States. Now, when we look at what we did to, of course, fix that mistake we made, we all know was a mistake. We implemented the 21st Amendment. We had to implement an additional amendment to change and override prohibition. 21st Amendment abolished the 18th Amendment. This is the only amendment implemented in U.S. history that repeals a previous amendment. So it is important to remember from this slide that you can repeal a past constitutional amendment only through the ratification of a new amendment. The 21st Amendment reads, Section 1, the 18th article of amendment to the Constitution of the United States is hereby repealed. Section 2, the transportation or importation into any state, territory, or possession of the United States for delivery or use therein of intoxicating liquors in violation of the laws thereof is hereby prohibited. And Section 3, it goes on, generally states that Congress is in charge for the implementation of this amendment. So, key takeaway, 18th, 21st, prohibition, the abolition of the Prohibition Amendment, and this represents the ability to repeal a past constitutional amendment. Now, the most recent constitutional amendment made in the United States, ratified in 1992, is the 27th Amendment. We currently have 27 amendments to our Constitution, as that wouldn't make sense. And where did this come to be? I'd like to include this because it has a very fascinating story. A college student at Texas University, just like you all are doing right now in this course, was tasked to write a paper on, well, if you chose to write about this prompt, which was one of the available ones, on the need for a specific constitutional amendment. In this essay, this student did a couple things. They, for one, researched what amendments were proposed in the past and then did not get ratified. And do they have any validity to them? Should we reconsider these amendments? Well, his approach was, her approach, I do not know, was to research James Madison's original Bill of Rights. Remember, the 17th Amendment Bill of Rights, originally proposed by James Madison at the Constitutional Convention. We see that, and out of this Bill of Rights, this student identified what was originally the Second Amendment, which stated that representatives, when elected to office, cannot increase the pay for their congressional period. If an elected representative voted to increase pay for individuals who work in the office that they obtain, it will not go into effect until there has been another election. So say I am a senator, there is a bill on the Senate floor stating that the pay to senators will increase tenfold. I vote for that bill, but my constituents are very upset because they do not believe I deserve that increased pay, and instead that money should go to their public resources. So they can then vote me out of office before I obtain a single dollar increase from my decision, which could possibly be self-interested. So this was an amendment aimed at discouraging self-interested representatives from increasing their pay. And Originally proposed by James Madison, this college student identified this in their research and wrote their college paper about it. Their professor, as you know, all stubborn professors do, gave them a not perfect grade. The student got a C on this essay, and they thought it was a little better than a C. So they then emailed it to just about as many elected representatives as they could. And it caught the attention of a congressman from Maine. A few steps later, after they took the approach of congressional proposal, they were able to ratify the 27th Amendment, which originated from a C-level college paper. So, hey, if I don't like your essay, maybe just send it to every elected representative you know. Maybe edit it a couple times. Maybe work with me if you want. I'm happy to help. But we can make change in the United States. And that first step could be a simple college paper. Now, let's look at the Electoral College case study before we wrap up today's lecture. So in 1968, there was a proposed amendment to our Constitution. This was an amendment that was supported according to Gallup polling, which is one of the most reliable polls in the United States, approved by 80% of the general population. We saw in the House, they voted to implement the new amendment with a 338 to 70 vote. Once this reached the Senate, we saw an individual filibuster this possible constitutional amendment. This filibuster resulted in the amendment not being ratified and ending the opportunity to abolish the Electoral College in 1968, as we were only 2 steps away, just 2/3 majority in the Senate and then 3/4 ratification in state legislatures. So we see that the filibuster successfully halted the possibility of abolishing the Electoral College in 1968. And this results in, when we look at the Electoral College, a winner-takes-all system in the United States persisting in all but 2 states. And of course, remember, winner takes all Electoral College votes go to the winner of the election. Doesn't really state how they win the election, but if you win the election, you get 100% of the Electoral College states' votes. Montana has 4. Whoever wins the election in Montana for presidency gets all 4 of the Electoral College votes, even if they only obtained a less than majority percent of the popular vote. So we see, of course, winner takes all elections allows for election results to not match the popular vote perfectly. This overvalues swing states at times and discourages candidates from campaigning in certain states where their party is in the extreme minority, where if they didn't have a winner takes all election, we do see odds are that they would have more campaigning in smaller states to increase their margins whenever possible. So we do continue to have the Electoral College. If you look back on the readings of the past, there are arguments for and against it, but it is an issue, a system that has persisted in the United States for a long time. Now, what did we learn in part 2 of today's lecture? Remember, there are 2 what did we learn slides, so make sure you go back. Just to save time, I'm not going to read this all out to you right away. I'm going to continue on. Here are your answers. And please make sure, I'm going to make sure the dates for the final exam and final essay are right here and available. And you have an assignment this week, your last assignment in this course, a 3-2-1 analysis assignment. Read our readings for the week, pick one of them and write it's a quick and easy assignment. The directions are provided in the document on Eagle Online. And if you have any questions, please reach out to me and we got this. And really remember, it is the last stretch in this course. So please, please make sure you're making progress on your final essay and you're ready to take that final exam. The best way to study for your final exam, look at your answers on all of the quizzes. Make sure you understand the correct answer. You might have the same or very similar questions on your final exam, as it is cumulative. It covers everything we've covered in this course. Additionally, make sure you look at the what did we learn slides from all of our most recent lectures, which were not included on a quiz. So please study. Please reach out if there's anything I can do to help. We got this. Thank you for once again listening to me ramble about politics. You got to do it one more time. as we learn about foreign policy in the United States next week. Thank you guys.